about all those relative pitch systems is that they are technically, quote, incomplete. They don't micromanage the performer. They just give the musician a basic outline of the melody and say, hey, feel free to improvise inside this framework. And guess what? Western Europe was happily following this exact same line of evolution starting back in the 9th century. But then, bam! History caused some serious chaos. First, Emperor Charlemagne drops a massive political decree in the year 800, which creates an urgent need to teach a brand new, super complex system of chant, on pain of death, to all of Europe incredibly fast. Then, by the 10th century, church musicians started experimenting with organum. Singers were suddenly forced to perform totally unfamiliar plain chant and completely unexpected, uncomfortable musical patterns that their brains weren't used to. It was a total mess, and it forced them to invent a way more specific system of communication. Oh, and side note, my fluffy friends, if you want the juicy deep dive history behind the wild development of organum and Western harmony, go check out our previous episode, Pipe Dreams, episode number 3. It is a wild ride. So, when do we see the very earliest examples of this new Western plain chant notation? Right during the 9th century. And oh my whiskers, it looked nothing like what we have today. It used these little symbols called neumes, which were basically just squiggles and dots scratched right above the lyrics of the chant. They were meant to visually trace the melodic gestures and tone movements within each syllable, though they couldn't show specific pitches yet. If you look at it, this style might totally remind you of the early cantillation marks found in sacred Hindu, Hebrew, and Islamic texts. A certain scholar named Kenneth Levy has a few fascinating theories about where these mysterious little neumes actually came from. He thinks it could be linguistic pitch accents lifted straight out of classical Greco-Roman literature, or an imitation of the hand gestures that choir directors made to trace the melodies in the air as they were trying to teach them, or stylized editorial marks and punctuation signs, or, as we mentioned, religious cantillation systems, or it could be a chaotic mashup of 2 or 3 of these ideas. Even though historians love to debate this up and down the tunnel, the idea that neumes evolved from linguistic accents in classical literature is the one most folks accept today. At the end of the day, these neumes were just a handy-dandy memory aid for the singers. Because you couldn't determine exact pitches from them, performers still had to learn the core melody through old-school oral tradition, listening, repeating, and committing to memory. These two methods perfectly coexisted and complemented each other. And boy, did they need the help! Gregorian chant melodies were brand new to tons of communities, and things were getting standardized super fast because of Charlemagne's aggressive decree to completely wipe out local plain chant traditions and replace them with the Roman Gregorian rite. Seriously, check out episode 3, it's wild. So, neumes were a total lifesaver for choirs trying to navigate hours and hours of elaborate, completely memorized melodies for Mass. But then, shortly before the year 1000, scribes started getting a lot more careful with their handwriting. They wanted to give an even clearer visual hint of the pitches and intervals, so without actually drawing lines on the page, they just imagined invisible horizontal lines. They started writing the neumes higher or lower and in different lengths to represent the literal leaps between notes. This awesome 10th century upgrade is what we call diastematic or heightened neumes. Even though it was still relative and you couldn't pinpoint an exact pitch, it gave performers a massive advantage by mapping out a much clearer sense of the melody's shape. Once scribes started imagining that invisible guideline, it only took a few short decades before someone said, hey, why don't we just draw an actual line on the page? Brilliant! With a single solid line to orient the melody, scribes could fix a precise pitch to it, usually either the note F or the note C. Once that anchor was set, you could accurately figure out all the other pitches just by looking at where the neumes sat in relation to that line. And just like that, the musical staff was born. A legendary monk named Guido of Arezzo is usually credited as the inventor of the staff, and honestly, even if he didn't do it alone, scholars agree its widespread adoption was definitely thanks to his non-stop writings hyping it up. Over time, musicians kept adding more lines until a 4-line staff became the gold standard. Fun fact, our modern 5-line staff didn't even show up until around the 13th century. Even cooler, those starting anchor letters, F and C, slowly evolved over time into the stylized symbols we recognize on sheet music today, clefs. The treble clef is actually just a highly stylized, fancy version of the letter G, while the bass clef, also known as the F clef, is a dramatic historical evolution of the letter F. And guess what? That letter C that showed up early on evolved into what we call the alto clef, a lesser used clef used mostly by viola players and a few other instruments. Mind blown. For the very first time in Western history, exact pitches could be sent across the world without relying on oral memory. Guido of Arezzo actually thought the old way of memorizing everything was totally childish. He hyped up this new staff notation as, quote, an excellent method in finding an unknown melody, and most useful in practice. In fact, he bragged about using it to teach his students, saying, quote, after I began teaching this procedure to boys, some of them were able before the 3rd day to sing an unknown melody with ease, which by other methods would not have been possible in many weeks. Take that, old school tradition! Because of this revolutionary system, music could instantly hop across the borders of distant cities all over Europe. Performers could look at a piece of parchment and learn a brand new song without ever hearing it played first. That's a superpower we know today as sight reading. This completely flipped the script on what performers and listeners expected from music, and it still shapes our world today. By about 1026, Guido wrote a massive music treatise called the Microlagas. In this work, he gushes all about the virtues of the staff and lays out his personal methods for teaching Gregorian chant, alongside a ton of discussions about the brand new organum of the era. When you read Guido's work, you can see an early glimpse of the European fascination with labor-saving devices. Think about it. Now that choirs didn't have to waste hours and hours forcing music into their brains by memory, the medieval brain was totally freed up to explore wild, uncharted musical possibilities. Records of past music were preserved in stunning detail, which gave composers the ultimate green light to innovate like crazy. By the time the 13th century rolled around, those old squiggly neumes turned into square notation, drawn on a clean 4 or 5 line staff with a clef. This is where musical scores finally start looking like the sheet music we know and love. If a syllable had a quick group of notes going up, they stacked the squares on top of each other, which you read from bottom to top. If the notes went down, they used diamond shapes that you read from left to right. When you make a melody instantly readable without days of practice, 2 amazing things happen. Number 1, it completely unshackles the mind from memorization and rigid tradition, letting it run zoomies into totally unknown creative spaces. And 2, it allows the person writing the music to demand way more complex stuff from their performers, inspiring even more fabulous breaks with tradition. So Guido gave us a beautifully simple way to lock down pitch. But, oh my whiskers, notating rhythm turned out to be a massive headache the more elaborate this music became. When florid organum burst onto the scene in the 12th century, musicians suddenly hit a wall. They desperately needed a way to indicate time and rhythm. See, in the older style of parallel organum, all the voices moved together in lockstep rhythm, so you only needed to worry about the pitches. But in florid organum, the vocal layers are deliberately running at totally different paces. You've got different singers belting out different syllables at different speeds at the exact same time. Chaos! To keep 2 or more groups of singers from crashing into each other, they needed an organizing principle for rhythmic variation. Enter a legendary 12th century composer from the Notre Dame school named Leonin. He might just be the genius inventor behind the earliest surviving written rhythmic system we know of today. He wrote it all down in a massive book called the Magnus Liber Organi, introducing the 6 rhythmic modes of the Ars Antiqua. And get this, they based the musical rhythms entirely on the long and short pulses of poetic meters. In florid organum, the lowest voice, also known as the tenor, holds out these massive, long, sustained notes, while the upper voices are running wild with tons of quick, decorative notes called melismas. To make sure every single voice in the choir stays perfectly synchronous, so it actually sounds harmonious, they used these specific rhythmic modes, preset patterns of shorts and longs, to keep everyone in check. As the music grew more complex, the labor-saving devices of notation had to evolve too, which in turn allowed composers to explore even more complex and innovative styles. The two ideas just kept reinforcing each other in a beautiful cycle. The appearance of the motet in 1265 is a perfect example of this incredible evolution. In a medieval motet, composers would literally layer 2 completely different secular French songs right on top of a classic, slow-moving religious plain chant. That means these vocal lines were totally different in pitch, totally different in rhythm, and can you believe this? They were singing entirely different texts at the same time, one in Latin and the other 2 in French. Trying to communicate that level of brain-melting complexity to a choir would be completely impossible without a more advanced rhythmic system. Thank goodness a brilliant guy named Franco of Calonne stepped up. Between 1260 and 1280, he dropped a game-changing treatise called Ars Cantus Mensurabilis. Franco's big brain idea was to assign specific time values to individual notes just by changing their physical shapes. This was huge because it completely eliminated the old confusing rule where a note's rhythm depended on its position in a cluster or ligature pattern. From that moment on, the literal look of the note head told you exactly how long or short it was relative to the others. This independence of note symbols from the old modes is the single most important feature of the Franconian system. It means that every single note on the page can unmistakably broadcast its own definite rhythmic meaning all by itself. Plus, Franco formally defined the musical rest by creating specific symbols to represent a rhythmic value of pure silence. Notating silence into a thick, complex musical texture opened up a whole new world of nuance, finesse, and gorgeous tension in the late Ars Antiqua sound. Then, as we hop into the 14th century and the emergence of the Ars Nova, a major theorist named Philippe de Vitry became a leading superstar in the evolution of mensural notation. This was a mind-bogglingly cool method where even the most insanely complex rhythmic patterns could be easily sorted out across different hierarchical metric levels. The secret sauce here was finely specified note divisions that stood in rigid mathematical relationships with each other. This is where we get our modern notion of, for example, in one whole note, there are 4 quarter notes. And 2 quarter notes also equal a half note, or one half note has 4 eighth notes in it, etc., etc. It's all based in math. Honestly, you cannot underestimate how massive these notation developments were during this period. They laid down the foundations for how we have written music for the last 600 years. And it even gave us a solid groundwork for building computer-based music. Because of this innovation, music creators could finally be ultra-specific about exactly where and when a certain note should sound in relation to another. That meant a perfectly timed, purposeful stacking of pitches into harmonic structures. It was finally possible. This is the exact math-based system we use to organize musical timing to this very day. Our expectations as performers and listeners have changed so dramatically because of these complex systems. Today, a piece of music from absolutely any style or complexity can be communicated and learned lightning fast by anyone who speaks the language of musical symbols, including music that was written hundreds of years ago. No memorization or prior hearing required. And this totally changes the nature of oral tradition, too. Once a musician learns the basic skeleton of a piece from a manuscript, they're totally free to absorb the deeper artistic and cultural sound behind these symbols. They can bring their own unique interpretation to life and pass that extra magical meaning right along to the audience. All right, my fluffy friends, that is our big hop through history for today. Keep your ears pricked, your paws tapping, and your curiosity piqued. I'll see you next time in the burrow. Bye!